What exactly is the KT boundary? And why don't we find dinosaur fossils above it? For that and more, stay tuned. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you're at. Thanks for joining us here today. So, a few weeks ago, I was asked some questions by a high schooler at my dad's church up in Michigan. Rather than taking the time to type out a really long, detailed email, because I happened to be at a family gathering at the time, I decided to shoot her a few pre recorded 2.5 or so minute videos just answering her questions on paleontology. What about the KT boundary? Why don't we find dinosaur fossils above it? And so we're going to be talking about that specifically today. We'll throw in some other content, kind of as you'll see my progression as I start with one question and answer a whole bunch of others along the way. We'll wrap up talking about dinosaurs versus birds. But essentially, this was all off the cuff, off the top of my head. She asked me some questions. I wanted to give her some answers. And afterwards, I decided to splice it all together with a little bit of trimming just so it flows well. And I hope you all enjoy it. And if this does well, if it gets some good feedback, I might do more of this in the future. So, welcome and enjoy episode 1 of Dinosaur Archives Off the Cuff. So, essentially, the KC barrier, the KT layer, or boundary as it's called, is a layer at the very tail end of the flood. And we believe at least part of it in the area off of Mexico was caused by the Chicxulub asteroid. It's called the Chicxulub impact off of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. But it didn't cause the extinction of creatures. It didn't cause the extinction of the dinosaurs and pterosaurs and other animal groups. It impacted, again, like I said, that's at the tail end of the flood layers. So we believe it was that it struck down during the later layers or during the later stages of the flood. Because we have to remember, the flood wasn't just all done in an instant. There was that 40 days of constant raining and water coming from within the earth, and then outside of that there was about a year, just under a year, because again, take into account the 40 days, just under a year where the flood rose, got to its peak, and then eventually water started subsiding. But by the time that Noah and his family got onto the ark, from that time until when they actually got off of the ark was a total of about a year. I think just over, might be just a little under. But the Bible actually gives us a timeline for that. And so all throughout that, though, there was still lots of geologic activity happening. Earthquakes, volcanoes, all sorts of things were happening to cause new sedimentation on even the highest layers of the flood. And so we believe the asteroid hit near the end of the flood, and that's the reason that some of its impact is preserved, because it wouldn't be if it had been earlier in the flood. Continual geologic activity throughout the stages of the flood, throughout the months of the flood, would have wiped out any record of it, or at least made it so it wasn't as recognizable. So it was at the tail end of the flood. Now, as to your question about dinosaurs, so we have to remember, again, God created all kinds, every kind that has ever existed originally on days 5 and 6, as far as animals. Obviously, plant kinds would have been created on day 3. Flying and swimming creatures were created on day 5. That's what we read in Scripture. And land animals and the first 2 human beings, Adam and Eve, were created on day 6. So, all kinds, as of day 6, day 7, that time of creation, at the end of creation, about a little over 6,000 years ago, every kind, animal kind, that has ever been in existence was in existence at that time. Now, obviously, God didn't create all of the species as we see them today, but he put the genetic variability within the DNA of the original kind. So there wouldn't have been house cats, lions, and tigers, things like that. There would have been the original cat kind. We don't know. God maybe made multiple species of each kind at that time, but he made the original kind with the genetic variability to then, through speciation, also known as natural selection, to create, in a sense, to diversify into all these different species. It's the same thing we see today with domestic dogs. Within about the last 400 years, all of the major dog breeds that we have today came about within the last 400 years from gray wolves. Not exactly one specific pair, but from gray wolves found in Europe and North America. So one species of dog, Canis lupus, the gray wolf, produced all of these new varieties that we see in domestic dogs. So even Chihuahuas to the Great Dane to gray wolves, they're all the same. They're all dogs. They're all in the dog or canine kind. But you can see we can get a lot of variability. But at the end of that time frame, they're still dogs. They haven't changed into another kind. That's the difference between natural selection and evolution. Evolution requires a change of kind from point A to point B, whereas natural selection is only ever going to get you from A.1 to maybe another A.1 or A.2 or A.3, but you're always going to be A. You're never going to leave the dog kind, no matter how much natural selection, man-caused selective breeding or all that. You're always going to be a canine at the end of the day. That's the difference. Molecules to man evolution, in the case of going from a cat to a dog or from a dinosaur to a bird, cannot happen because that's not what God put in the DNA of these animals. So natural selection and evolution are two very different things. So from the time of creation to the time of the flood, which was a span of about 1,600 years, we get that number when we add up the genealogies that we find in the early chapters of Genesis that give us the timeline all the way from Adam to the flood, to Noah and the flood. And so from that timeline, from that time, that time span was about 1,600 years. And within that time, there was a lot of genetic variability. I mean, again, see the variability we see within just coming from the gray wolf, one species of dog. Within that, we get all the variety of domestic dogs within 400 years. So imagine the variety you can get in all the different kinds in about 4 times that, 1,600 years. So from the original created kinds, we get all the species that we find fossilized in the flood layers. But we have to remember, the flood layers, so there's 3 major layers that make up the rock record, or the fossil record. Only 2 of those are considered to be flood layers. So there's the Paleozoic, then there's the Mesozoic, and then there's the Cenozoic above that. The Paleozoic and the Mesozoic we consider to be flood layers. We find evidence of catastrophe in those layers. And then in the layers after that, the Cenozoic, we believe maybe some of the early Cenozoic layers were either at the very end of the flood, like when the Chicxulub impact was shortly thereafter, or were immediately post-flood, or came from things like, obviously, woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers, things like that. Their fossils are found in post-flood layers. So they died off and were fossilized after the flood. But the only reason they're fossilized is because of, again, catastrophe. Just because an animal dies doesn't mean it's going to become a fossil. We don't find modern animals becoming fossils today, because when animals die, they don't just sit around waiting to become a fossil. They rot, there's decay, there's scavenging from other predators and things like that, bacteria. Things break down. That's how God has created the world to exist in this post-sin timeline, because we can think of it pretty simply. God didn't want just dead bodies building up. So after sin, God put in place this system of recycling and of decomposition so that things aren't just breaking down all the time. So that's why we don't find fossils today of modern animals. Now, you have to have specific conditions. It doesn't take millions of years to make a fossil. We can make fossils in the lab today in about 24 to 36 hours. It just takes the right condition, which always entails rapid burial. You have to cut off the organic matter from an outside source, from oxygen, from bacteria, and things like that. That's going to break it down. Now, that's why we can't really have natural fossils today, unless, again, it's in rare instances. So, back to what I was saying about the flood layers. Or about the fossil layers. So again, there's 3 major layers in the fossil record: Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. The majority of, we believe a little bit of the bottom might not be, but the majority of the Cenozoic is all post-flood. We don't know exactly when. Some of it was during the Ice Age, which began approximately 100 years or so after the time of the flood, and lasted for about 500 to 600 years. some sources will say 7. But that's where we get a large majority of the Cenozoic fossils from. Things like woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, Neanderthal men, and things like that. Neanderthal men, which are just human beings. They're just variety within humanity today. We see variety in people today, but they're fully formed human beings made in the image of God, not on their way to evolving to a higher form of human being. They're just men. Even evolutionists will admit that. Most will admit that today. They're not a missing link. They're human beings. But anyway, they lived in more rugged areas, so they have more rugged features. So, the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic, that's what we're focusing on. Those are the two major flood layers, and those are broken down into further layers. Paleozoic is broken down into 7 smaller layers, going from the Cambrian, I struggle with the Paleozoic more than Mesozoic, the Cambrian layer, and then all the way up to the Permian layer. Then you got a small boundary between the Permian and the earliest Mesozoic layer, which is the Triassic. The Mesozoic is made up of Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. Those names might sound familiar, especially if you're a fan of Jurassic Park. And the Mesozoic is broken down into 3 smaller layers, the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. Now, evolutionists will call the Mesozoic era, as they call it, because they believe these layers are representing time, not burial, not a rapid burial. So they believe the Mesozoic era is the age of the dinosaurs. That's what you'll hear them call it. Because, again, they believe the layers went gradually over millions of years. The reason they call it the age of the dinosaurs is because those are the only 3 major layers that we find dinosaur fossils in. They're only found in Mesozoic layers. And there's this very simple explanation for that. Animals today don't live in every ecosystem. So we have to remember that the flood layers is not a progression of evolution over millions of years. It's a progression of burial. So the creatures at the lowest elevations in the lowest lying ecosystems, mainly the ocean floor and upper levels of the ocean, they're going to be buried first. That's what we find pretty much exclusively throughout most of the Paleozoic, the lowest layers, is marine organisms. Now, we find marine organisms throughout all of the layers because as floodwaters rise, living marine organisms that hadn't been buried would, of course, move into the new space that they had. They had new territory they could expand into, and they'd be carried with currents and things into the new layers. Not new layers, into the new ocean space, in a sense, as the ocean grew taller and larger. And then some would continue to get buried further on. So we find marine organisms all throughout the layers. Dinosaurs, however, lived in, we essentially consider those layers, you can liken them to being different ecosystems. So there's the Triassic ecosystem, which was a very low elevation. And higher in elevation, you had the Jurassic. And then higher even in elevation, you had the Cretaceous ecosystem. And we have different dinosaurs. Just like today, different dinosaurs lived in different ecosystems. And you mentioned the barrier between a reptile layer and a mammal layer. That's evolutionists fudging the data. There are mammals found in pretty much all of the dinosaur layers. And we don't find massive mammals, but because, just like today, when you have a mainly dominated by mammals ecosystem, you don't find many large reptiles. Just like we find mammal-dominated ecosystems today, with little to no reptile inclusion, the opposite was true in the past, where when dinosaurs were still around, they were the dominant land forces, especially the larger ones. Obviously, some of the smaller ones would be food for even mammals and amphibians and larger reptiles and things like that. But predominantly, especially the larger dinosaurs, they were the dominant animal force in those areas, in those particular ecosystems. So when an ecosystem is dominated by massive large reptiles, there's not really any massive mammals. But we do find lots of small mammals. In fact, there's one site in somewhere out west, I can't remember the exact name, where there are dinosaur fossils, and found with them are fish that are just like we see today, mammals like squirrels, things that are almost like beavers and badgers, and all sorts of creatures that we still find today, and some of them being mammals. But typically the ones you see on all the diagrams are the ones that have been pre-selected to match the story of the progression of evolution. So the ones that don't fit the story are often omitted. But you can find lots of examples where there are plenty of mammal specimens found in dinosaur layers. Also, mammals in general tend to be a lot faster moving than reptiles do. And so in general, it's We don't have all the answers, but it's simply believed that the mammals were, for the most part, except some of the smaller ones, a whole lot better at escaping the rising floodwaters and getting to higher ground. And obviously, God's word says that everything except the animals on the ark and the 8 people on board, of course it excludes the marine animals, because lots of marine animals would be just fine in a flood. They weren't required on the ark. But for all the land animals that weren't on the ark, they died. But it seems to be, either we just haven't found them yet, but that's possible, but it seems to be the likely case is that most of the large mammals and things that seem to be missing, they simply escaped the rising floodwaters to the point where there was nowhere left to go, and they were washed out to sea, they drowned, and their corpses were scavenged and eaten by aquatic creatures, to where they weren't buried. They did die, but they weren't buried in lower flood layers like dinosaurs were, and likely the same is true for some of the dinosaurs they escaped. Now, to kind of wrap up here, so why don't we find dinosaur fossils post-flood, like we find the mammal fossils? Well, because again, dinosaurs were land animals. They would have been included on the ark. Not all, but 2 representatives of each kind. There's anywhere from about 50 to maybe 80 different kinds. It's a lot harder to determine kinds, the biblical kind, which would mostly be at the family level of our modern taxonomic chart. But it's a lot harder to determine the kind level and which ones are in the same kind when we're dealing with extinct animals, because we can't directly test if they can reproduce. But we can make assumptions based off of comparative anatomy, physiology, and things like that. So we believe there's anywhere from 50 to 85 dinosaur kinds, likely closer to 50. All that to say, there would have been 2 of each of those dinosaur kinds represented on the ark. They would have come off the ark. However, for the same reason we can't 100% say what caused the extinction of the dinosaurs, we don't know exactly why we don't find any fossils of them post-flood. The likely reason being is that most of the fossil layers that we find post-flood, again, they're all from natural catastrophes, things like the Ice Age and different events, earthquakes, landslides. Most of them tend to be, like the Ice Age, in areas where you're not really likely to find any large reptiles like dinosaurs. And dinosaurs in general, for the same reason we don't see them today, seem to have not fared terribly well after the flood. They came off the ark to a completely different ecosystem that they had never seen before, nothing like it. There's lots of good evidence supporting that the types of plants that dinosaurs ate, herbivorous dinosaurs ate, were either in little to no quantity after the floods. They had food, but it was very limited or non-existent, and they had to change their diets or starve. And so lots of things didn't go well for the dinosaurs after the flood. There's always the human factor as well. It's believed that many dinosaurs were hunted by human beings either out of fear or maybe for sport or even possibly for food. Just like large animals are today, the larger dinosaurs could easily have been killed off. And being reptiles, they don't reproduce nearly as quickly as mammals do, so they weren't able to keep up a population. There's lots of reasons that seem to have caused the downfall of the dinosaurs slowly and gradually over time after the flood. They just didn't fare well over the centuries afterwards. They slowly died away. But it wasn't all of them at once. It wasn't all the carnivorous ones, all the herbivorous ones. No, they gradually died out at different times, just like species go extinct today. It's one of the results of living in a fallen, sin-cursed world. It's a result of our sin. So over time, they died out, but they did certainly live post-flood. We just don't find them fossilized for the same reasons we don't find lots of other creatures fossilized in post-flood layers, because fossilization is a very rare event. It doesn't happen all the time. It takes special, unique situations to cause fossilization, because most things just die and get immediately scavenged or decay over time, like roadkill and things like that. Think about how quickly roadkill is gone. Now, as to what you said, so we try not to use the word evolution, because evolution, when we're talking with people out and about, it implies to them what's called molecules to man evolution. That's kind of the accepted definition of evolution. In the past, it used to just mean change, and things do change, but not like evolution really means today. Apes don't turn into human beings. Dinosaurs didn't turn into birds. So like birds, Scripture specifically talks about, they were created on day 5. The Hebrew word for birds means all the flying creatures. That would include birds, pterosaurs, bats, and things like that. They were created on day 5. Dinosaurs were created on day 6. And so birds could not have evolved from dinosaurs. Evolution, like most people think of it today, doesn't happen. Microevolution, in the sense of natural selection, finches developing different beak sizes, variation in dogs, and things like that, that's true, that happens. Things reproduce according to their kinds, and there's variation within those kinds. But molecules to man evolution is simply not true. There are just so many differences between them. Birds and dinosaurs, we've got lots of great research on this that I can point you to, are so incredibly different. Dinosaurs are reptiles, birds are birds. Birds are unlike any other animal group that has ever existed. They're so complex with their respiratory system, feathers and things like that. You simply cannot obtain a feather coming from reptilian scales. They are so complex and so biologically costly. You can't simply just have feathers for the sake of having feathers, hence why feathered dinosaurs are also false and not true. And any feathered dinosaur discovery you hear about is either going to be a bird that's simply being called a dinosaur because they've redefined what a dinosaur is to fit this evolutionary story, or it's a true dinosaur, but what's being considered fossilized feathers is nothing more than collagenetic fibers, connective tissues, things like that, that really only occur in rare, exceptionally pristine preservation that we see in a few places, like in China. Seem to have been unique places of the flood that preserve things exquisitely. But anyway, dinosaurs and birds, not at all related. There's no relation between a chicken and a Tyrannosaurus. The balance points is completely different. Birds balance at the knees. Dinosaurs and most creatures balance at the hips. Eyesight, reproduction, the types of eggs birds have versus reptiles, all these things are so different between dinosaurs and birds. Chickens and Tyrannosaurus rex are not at all related. They are two completely different types of creatures. Really, comparing chickens to a T-Rex is like comparing a white-tailed deer to a crocodile. There's just so many differences. Now people will say, well, look, they're both bipedal, isn't that, and they both have kind of similar bone structures. Well, so do kangaroos. Kangaroos have a relatively similar bone structure to theropod dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus, Allosaurus, things like that. No one's arguing that they evolved from dinosaurs because it doesn't fit their paradigm. They need birds to have come from somewhere. They need dinosaurs to have gone somewhere. So they argue that many of them evolved into birds and that that's where birds came from. It's a worldview issue, not an issue of facts.